Good evening and welcome. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone and to thank you for joining us this evening for the 12th annual Hayek Lecture here at NYU Law School. I want to begin by thanking our keynote speaker, Professor Ellickson, for taking the time to join us tonight. Our colleague Richard Epstein will introduce Professor Ellickson in a moment, but I want to say as well myself how grateful we are to have you here to present what I'm sure will be a terrific lecture. The Hayek Lecture, as you know, is jointly sponsored by the Classical Liberal Institute here at NYU Law School and by the NYU Journal of Law and Liberty. The lecture was first held in 2005 with Professor Richard Epstein as its inaugural lecturer, and that was in many ways the beginning of Richard's deep relationship with the law school, and he after that joined our faculty as the inaugural Lawrence Tisch Professor of Law. If it were required to give a complete introduction to Richard Epstein, then that's all we would do this evening, and we wouldn't get anywhere near through the story. If there is a picture associated with the definition of the word indefatigable, it must be a picture of Richard Epstein. He wears an amazing number of hats here, but is at bottom one of the most original thinkers in the last 50 years at least in American law. He is an immensely important member of this faculty in both his teaching and his scholarship. He is a generous colleague. He is a huge influence on the shape of the way we think about law in this country and beyond, and we are enormously proud to count him as our colleague here at NYU. The Classical Liberal Institute, which Richard co-directs with NYU economics professor Mario Rizzo, is itself an important part of the school. It has a rather expansive and interdisciplinary mission held together by a guiding commitment to examining the role of sound systems of property rights and contract in advancing human welfare within a framework of limited government. And as I say, it is co-sponsoring the Hayek Lecture together with our Journal of Law and Liberty, which is the first student-edited law journal dedicated to the interdisciplinary exploration of classical liberal ideas. We are enormously grateful to Richard for his leadership of the Classical Liberal Institute, among many other things, and indeed for all of his contributions to the law school. With that, please join me in welcoming Richard Epstein.
Hi. Oh, they even give the title of the lecture here, so I'm perfectly safe in my introduction. Anyhow, it is really a very great honor to welcome you here. I'm doing so not only on my own behalf, but also on behalf of Mario Rizzo, who's my co-director, and Eva Dora, who's the only person who actually knows where the things and the pieces and the parts are parked, so as to keep us at the appropriate time. I'm also happy to say that sitting in the front row, I have three of the fellows here, Robert Miller, Stephanie Jung, and Shruti Rajagopalan, right? Which I've learned after many years how to pronounce. We have put this thing together starting in 2013. And one of the things that we do is to host the Hayek Lectureship along with the Journal of Law and Liberty, the title of which is taken from the 3-volume set of books put together by Hayek in the 1970s. And it's peculiarly appropriate under these circumstances to have Robert Ellickson come, because in many ways he is sort of the embodiment of Hayekian institutionalism, a man who understands things from the ground up quite literally, not somebody who looks at things from the top down. And I'm also very proud that Robert is here because he's been a long and close friend of mine. I first met him in the fall of 1969 when he came out and he interviewed for a teaching position at the University of Southern California, when I, at the ripe old age of 26, was on the hiring committee, dispensing the wisdom of the ages beyond all possible compare. And Robert came out, and in fact, he had a very interesting background. He did study at Oberlin College, for which we forgive him, and he also went to the Yale Law School. And then he spent a year at MIT, I believe, doing urban studies. And if I'm not mistaken then, he did the most important graduate education of his life. He spent 2 years working for Levitt & Sons out there on Long Island. And what he did was he actually saw how real estate and land use development took place from the bottoms up. For those of you who don't know what Levittown is. It was put together by Levitt and Sons builders, and this was this huge post-World War II community which transformed very large segments of Long Island in a highly provocative, imaginative, and successful way. And having the experience of working for an outfit like that, I think probably shaped Robert for the rest of his career, because he never opposed or approached law as a field to be studied in opposition to practice. It was a field to be studied as a complement to practice. Now, when he came out to Los Angeles, the thing I first remember about Robert, and it was not listed in any of his biographies, but I'm going to tell you about it anyhow, was the brown Nash Rambler that he drove. This was a man who, shall we say, had no common sense whatsoever. He drove this dilapidated car across the country, comes to the Los Angeles freeways, and essentially his first major land use adjustment was to trade that car in for a newer model because it could have not made it anywhere on other freeways. And he and I were colleagues at USC for 2 years, from 70 to 72. He remained there, if I'm not mistaken, until 1981, and in the middle he came and visited me when I was at the University of Chicago in 1974, 1975. And he used to say how much he loved his Sundays in Chicago in the cold, the winter, and returned to USC, then to Stanford. When he was at Stanford, he undertook what I think is one of the most remarkable pieces of empirical research ever undertaken by any academic. He was closer to Shasta County, and on weekends, starting on Friday or whatever it was, he would drive and motor up there and watch the way in which people on the ground actually worked in resolving their disputes with respect to animals. And he wrote a book on this some years later, by which time he was at the Yale Law School, essentially called Order Without Law, How Neighbors Settled Disputes, if I'm not mistaken. And in fact, it was one of the more extraordinary books ever written on this subject, which won him a Coif Prize, I think, in 1996. And it's still fresh and original, and one should read it today, because what you do, in effect, is you see the way in which legal doctrine and private practice of one kind or another essentially start. And I think it's fair to say that Robert is one of the founders of the sort of law and social norms movement in the United States, probably its most preeminent expositor of those particular elements. He's also done a number of other things. I've had the great pleasure on multiple occasions to teach from his status book on land use planning, which he put together, this is a joke, with, amongst others, Vicki Bean and now Rick Hills of this particular faculty. And he has always written on wonderful topics. He has this eye. And this talk is going to be no exception, because he's going to talk about three things which I'm sure he will put together in a way that I have not fully anticipated. If I have it correctly, one of them is going to be street grids, and Rick Brooks and I, who had lunch today, essentially had a spirited discussion on this particular issue. Then he's going to talk about Lighthouse, and for those of you who don't understand this, the Lighthouse was the subject of some very interesting work by Ronald Coase on the question of whether it was a public good or a private function. And then he's going to go into much dicier territories, and he's going to talk about aid to the needy as a Hayekian imperative. And what I want to add to you is this is not inconsistent with Hayek, because Hayek himself, particularly in his last works, and even as far back as The Road to Serfdom, was always a kind of a social democrat who thought that in addition to market institutions and public infrastructure, you need to have some kind of a minimum support program, which made him, as I mentioned to Bob earlier, in some ways at least, quite similar to Bill Clinton, who was president of the United States. I don't want to steal his thunder. I would not be able to do so. So I hope we will all welcome here to the podium, where he will give us a great high-tech talk, having 2 monitors on which he will display all the maps that you could ever hope to see. So give a good hand to Bob.
At our age, it's nice to be reminded of one's youth, so I appreciate that, Richard. And we, believe it or not, we played basketball. Richard could go 6 inches above the rim in his prime. It's true that I've written a book called Order Without Law, and my talk today actually is about that law actually might be useful in some respects to provide order. So this is contrary to the the main theme of that particular book. This is the Hayek lecture, and I'm a contrarian. I knew that most of the people here would be associated with classical liberal ideas, and being a contrarian, therefore, I thought what I would try to do is defend the role of government, defend the role of taxes, of regulation, of these horrible things that often classical liberals are negative about. And it will be a limited defense because I am someone who thinks that we have far too much regulation and also too much taxation in general. But that was not Hayek's view. Hayek, in fact, had thought long and hard about the role of government and favored affirmative government activity in some endeavors. Let me give you my take on Hayek himself. Because I was giving this lecture, it's named after Hayek, I undertook to read Hayek's books, starting with The Road to Serfdom, and I recommend that to you. This is a man who got the Nobel Prize in economics and deserved it, in my judgment, and for the following insight, which is a very basic insight that he had before anyone else did, and it's connected to the notion of the economics of information. Would we be better off in New York if there was a czar who appointed by the mayor to control the supply of food to New York City? Because the reality is no one is in charge of the supply of food to New York City, and you might think that a politician would say, I run on the campaign of appointing a czar who will actually make up for this lack that we have of not having anybody coordinating food supply. Hayek was the first person to think about the fact that actually it was better not to have a czar because if you had a central planner who undertook to coordinate the supply of food, they could never get the information they needed to do that. That right now, the information needed to provide food to New York City is decentralized to many, many players who have local knowledge, to use a phrase that comes from Hayek, but he did not use himself. That coordination through the market, and this is what he did say explicitly in The Road to Serfdom, coordination through the market actually for something tremendously complex works better than central planning. That if you have a czar, as they had in Moscow, for example, the supermarkets will end up having empty shelves, as indeed they did. This idea was later picked up and made more systematic by people like George Stigler, who wrote an important article in 1961 called The Economics of Information. The transaction cost economics, inspired by Coase's article on social cost, gave rise to enormous amount of attention to information, but Hayek was there first, and I think therefore worthy of the Nobel Prize that he received. Being a contrarian, I will also praise three things that the city of New York did during the 19th century. And I will have slides showing all these three things. You might think about what three things New Yorkers might have been proud that their government did in the 19th century ahead of time. But in order to establish my credentials here, that Mario and Richard were not crazy in inviting me, let me now insult the city of New York for having performed poorly in the areas that I follow, namely of housing and land use. The only competition to New York in being the seller in terms of policymaking in this area, I think, might be the city of San Francisco. But I think the city of New York outstrips the city of San Francisco handily in the following three areas. New York City has had rent control forever, in my view. This is, I will say things, very conclusory things. I've actually written about these things, and in the question and answer can go deeper into them for those who do feel insulted of the insulting policies, insulted that I'm insulting these policies of the city of New York. New York City is a bastion of rent control. For me, enough said. This is not good policy. New York City invented exactly 100 years ago the first comprehensive zoning ordinance in the United States. Actually, it followed the city of Los Angeles by a little bit, but it's the most famous of the zoning ordinances. As Hayek himself noticed, the value of a piece of land depends on what's going next door, and therefore there are externalities, and actually this is a tricky problem, and that's worthy of a course in land use that Richard occasionally actually teaches. On the other hand, my own view is that zoning in a place like New York probably does more harm than good in many ways. There are real externalities from from land uses, but Edward Glaser is the leading authority on housing prices in New York, and Glaser thinks that the lack of density in New York has driven up housing prices and made it much harder for younger people in particular to live here, so I will not give New York any positive points for having invented zoning. New York once had a senator named Robert Wagner. Robert Wagner invented a program, borrowed a program that New York had and took it national, and it was a program called public housing. This was invented in the city of New York, in the state of New York, and was taken national by Robert Wagner in 1937. I will say as a conclusionary matter, I can expand on this if you would like, that this is another demerit in the history of New York policies. The current mayor is in favor of something called mandatory inclusionary zoning, which is that anyone who develops an apartment building has to set aside a certain number of units for lower income families. I've written about this before most of you were born and was critical from the outset that this was a very bad form of welfare benefit. I'm going to endorse having some sort of welfare programs, but this, I think, is an inferior one. So I've taken to insult, since I'm going to praise certain things that went on in New York in the 19th century, you should not take this as a blanket endorsement of everything that the city of New York does. All right, and here we are. I will actually speak about these three subtopics in out of order. The first one I will talk about is lighthouses. But I want to relate the libertarian thought to a book by another Nobel Prize winner, Daniel Kahneman. If you've not read this book, I do recommend it. I think it's an excellent book. He got also a psychologist by training, but he received the Nobel Prize in economics. And in this book, he says that we make decisions in two ways. Most of our decisions we make heuristically, very, very quickly, using what he calls System 1. It's very, very fast. He loves System 1, but it is mistake prone. And a fair amount of the book is designed to show you that, in fact, if you make decisions fast, you're likely to make mistakes. Another way of making decisions is to be a rational actor, which is the basic model in economics. And the problem with that is that it's tiring. You make better decisions when you think long and hard about things, but because we are lazy, in fact, you often fall back on System 1 because that's the nature of people to be lazy. So I'll come back at the end of my talk to these notions. But I relate this to works in libertarian theory. So if you have not read some of these works, I recommend that you read some of them that you might that might appeal to you. I think that there are two authors who I will compare to start with who are what I will call slow-thinking classical liberals. They actually think long and hard about what markets can do and what governments can do, and they don't have knee-jerk reactions to it. And the two are listed there at the top. One is Hayek, who repeatedly in his books, you get a little bored actually reading Hayek. He really tortures himself with what should government do. Should we have building codes? He thinks actually yes. So Hayek is a slow-thinking person. Milton Friedman's book, I think, is a better read than Hayek's, Capitalism and Freedom, and I do think if you're a libertarian, if you have not read that work, I very much recommend it to you. Friedman tortures himself with thinking about what government should do and what government should not do. I contrast those two with the people I call fast-thinking anarcho-capitalists, and that's what they call themselves. This is a very small category of people, perhaps no one in the room, but it will be a much more lively time if there are some anarcho-capitalists here, because the people I am targeting here are anarcho-capitalists. Anarcho-capitalists at the extreme want to have no government at all, because government involves coercion, and we're better off with freedom, and therefore our goal is to abolish government. The quintessential anarcho-capitalist is someone named Murray Rothbard. You might want to look into that work if you have not read it. The other two that I list here are not quintessential anarcho-capitalists because they are not quite as fast-thinking. If you're an anarcho-capitalist, you would say, Do we want to have taxes? The answer is always no. Do we want to have regulation? The answer is always no. You can really come up with answers very, very quickly about what to do. I happen to think that's wrong. But the other two that I mentioned, a famous one is Robert Nozick, who is actually very close to Rothbard. He wants to have the night watchman state, and basically thinks government should be extremely limited. I also mentioned David Friedman. There are others I could go into here. That this is not. These are not the only folks. David Friedman being actually the son of Milton Friedman, who is Milton Friedman not being an anarcho-capitalist, but David Friedman is. The main principle of the anarcho-capitalist is that voluntary exchange is the way to go. Voluntary exchange preserves freedom, allows people to consensually contract. I compare it here at the bottom with Pareto optimality. If people can, in fact, exchange in economic theory, everybody is going to gain, assuming the contracts are fair, and contrast it with Kaldor-Hicks efficiency, which is what you're going to get if government does things like regulate. So there are these anarcho-capitalists, and my thesis here for you is if you are an anarcho-capitalist, you should think about whether that's a sound position, and maybe what you're doing is just having something that gives you a very fast reaction to any kind of government program. You always know if it involves taxes, you're against it. If it involves regulation, you're against it, but I would say that's actually wrong. What markets cannot accomplish. Richard mentioned the lighthouses. This is inspired by a famous article by Ronald Coase that appeared in 1974. This is the Eddystone Light, which is the most famous lighthouse in England. And Coase included in this article unfortunately, I think,
Yeah, I'm so sorry. We need to maximize.
okay, okay, there's no pictures. Okay, well,
Yeah.
all right.
I'm so sorry about this.
Well, we had it set up, we had
did.
it going, but this is
Isaiah, can you help me? It's maximized on this one.
it crashed.
I see what happened.
I'm so
Okay.
sorry,
I'm
everyone.
sorry, pardon me. Yeah, we must have had a little issue here. Hopefully they can fix this in post.
This is called Murphy's Law, which is actually order without law, Murphy's Law, not an actual law. You see a lighthouse?
There you are. Terribly
Okay,
sorry
good,
about
okay,
that.
sure. Okay, this was my prior slide where I actually listed works. And I referred to actually places of, at the bottom of the slide and things that were, I'm sure, mystifying to you. So slow thinking classical liberals, which I urge you to be. Okay, what markets cannot accomplish. That puts it to perhaps some people in the room. Coase wrote this famous article in 1974 and included, unfortunately, in my judgment, the following phrase: a lighthouse service can be provided by private enterprise. And basically, this article, if you've read it, it's actually an interesting article to read because like a lot of things that Coase did, it has wonderful institutional detail about Trinity House that managed the lighthouses in England. But actually, this is an extremely misleading article, and in fact, markets cannot provide lighthouses by almost everybody's appreciation since then. What markets can do is actually run a lighthouse, as occurred in England, and that's what Coase was actually, if he were to defend himself, would say, well, this is actually privately run. But that's like saying that the fireworks, another classical public good, are the fireworks we have on the 4th of July over the Statue of Liberty. Where do we have them here in New York? What? Over the Hudson River. Okay, so will private enterprise provide fireworks on the 4th of July? The classic economic analysis is no, because a lot of people will enjoy it, but you will not be able to collect fees from the people who enjoy it. There'll be all these free riders, and therefore fireworks on the 4th of July will not be provided by the market. You can hire a contractor to do it, as the city of New York does, but you cannot expect the market to provide it. The lighthouses are the same. This is the classical analysis of lighthouses. So Cosa is correct that there were private lighthouses here, but they survived because customs officers collected fees in the harbors from all the ships that came in, and these fees were mandatory. These were not a matter of voluntary contract. You had to pay the fee. There are 5 articles that have come out since Cosa's article, the first one by David Van Zandt, making this point. So Cosa's example of what the market can do with lighthouses, in fact, is false. I now turn to a topic that Richard and I have discussed for 40 years, which is the so-called Mill Acts. If you know the Kelo case, which is a famous case in property rights involving the use of eminent domain, there's a great discussion in the Thomas dissent in that case of the Mill Acts. Do we want to have lighthouses in our economy, unless we want a lot of ships to crash on the rocks and so forth? The answer is yes, we do. We're not going to get them without having government collected fees. And similarly, if we want mills, and our ancestors here a couple centuries ago wanted grist mills to grind grain and sawmills to saw lumber, we might not get them without having things called the Mill Acts, which were coercive acts. This is much more controversial, but let me show you what the problem was. This is from Sturbridge Village. If you want to see a sawmill powered by water today, you can go to Massachusetts and see this. The problem with the Mill Act is that if you dam a stream like this to create the head of water you need to run your sawmill, you will flood a certain area. And it might be that you will flood so much land that you will not be able to acquire through consensual contracts those tracts. And what the Mill Acts did was allowed people to coerce floodés into selling their rights as a matter of law to the builder of the mill. Sometimes they received 150% compensation. There were ways to limit the use of this power. And notice also that a lot of these ponds were fairly small, and arguably that consensual transactions would have worked. So this was controversial. At any rate, during the 19th century, a time of limited government in the United States, when classical liberal ideas were in the saddle for the only time in American history. They weren't in the saddle before then. There was mercantilism before them. They weren't in the saddle in the 20th century, but during the 19th century they were, and during that period, in fact, many states enacted these Mill Acts. A more current controversy involves, and this is one that you might have a view on, and I hope Richard perhaps will give his current ideas about this, is pipelines. Do we want to have pipelines? Well, that depends. If you're anti-carbon, you might say no, but many people, in fact, think pipelines are a good thing. Can you get pipelines by contract? And I would say the answer is, in many, many contexts, you can't get a Nozikian kind of bargain or a Murray Rothbard kind of bargain and get pipelines. You have to use eminent domain. This is an issue. Richard, in his book Takings and in other writings that he has done, recognizes that there can be real land assembly problems, and if you want to have pipelines, you may have to allow eminent domain by a private party in order to acquire the right-of-way, because otherwise you simply won't get a pipeline, or you'll get it much, much later than you otherwise would. Another eminent figure emerging figure in libertarian thought is Ilya Somin and so forth. And he, at times, has what I'll call an unholy alliance with green people, where he opposes eminent domain for pipelines because he is an ardent property rights advocate. He feels badly about this, so I wouldn't call him a slow thinker or a fast thinker. I would say he's occasionally fast thinker, but occasionally slow thinker. That he is a little bit mixed on this. But you might think in your own mind about whether or not you want to have pipelines or you want to have pure contracts, because in my view, in many, many contexts, if it's going to be pure contracts, you're not going to have any pipelines at all. And think about whether Ilya Somin has a sounder view on that. Okay, I now present three triumphs of 19th century New York City. And I start with, I think, the no-brainer, the one they would be proudest of, which is this bridge. Walking distance from here, Brooklyn Bridge. Can you get this by contract? Can you get it the Robert Nozick way? And the answer is, you don't get the Brooklyn Bridge. Your choice is honoring the principle of free contract or having a Brooklyn Bridge. And if you had quizzed New Yorkers about that, there's no doubt of where they would come up. We like our Brooklyn Bridge. We're proud of our Brooklyn Bridge. This is one of the wonders of the world, the longest bridge in the world at the time that it was built. Why can't you get it by contract? Because the approaches to the Brooklyn Bridge are about a mile long on both ends of the bridge. And to assemble that land, you had to use the power of eminent domain. You had to coerce people. If you want the Brooklyn Bridge, you can't do it by contract. You can't do it the way the anarcho-capitalists would want you to do it. The main thing that I will talk about now is one of my passions, which is streets. This is an unusual passion, so let me try to interest you in streets. I do think coming to NYU, I couldn't help but think that you are the most knowledgeable people about street patterns in New York City. You're in exactly the location where the street patterns change, and you might have attitudes about streets. So let me talk about streets. This is a picture of a great book that was done by somebody here at NYU who's still on the NYU faculty, Hilary Ballon. And it's called The Greatest Grid. You see the shape of Manhattan there, and you see the part that is gridded. How did the city of New York develop? It developed at the very tip of Manhattan. This is the way Manhattan looked in 1775. NYU at that time was way out in the boondocks, way out in the rural areas. Only the tip was developed. You may go see the show Hamilton, which you should, by the way. I think it's consistent with classical liberal values. I would guess that I can be challenged into a question and answer, and I don't know what I would say. But the New York that Hamilton comes to in 1775 is this tiny little tip of Manhattan, and the streets are chaotic as can be. It's just spontaneous order, if you will, bottom-up streets. What happened in New York City, as many of you know, was that the key event occurs in 1811 when the commissioners issue a report that lays out a grid roughly from NYU going north of a set of streets. And then the question in your own mind is, why did they do this in a laissez-faire society? Because what did they think? Why did they think this was a good idea? Why didn't they couldn't let streets continue to bubble up? You also probably have an attitude toward this grid. Since it's the north of NYU, this is what you have, and you know the streets south of NYU, and you might have a preference for one or another about which one might be better. My guess is Hayek would favor the grid. My guess is that Milton Friedman would favor the grid. I think it's not clear because they were not particularly urbanists, and they didn't talk about these things very much. But here is the pattern for you to look at of how streets developed in the city of New York. What happened in New York was you had the tip that was very chaotic, wall and broad streets and so forth. As New York grew through a process that I don't know anybody has written much about, microgrids were imposed on parts of the island. Who imposed those microgrids, I don't know. They still exist here in the West Village, for example, and they are all tilted against each other. But you can see there that there are lots of rectangular blocks that were produced in Lower Manhattan, but they are produced within microgrids that don't fit well together. And if you don't believe this is still the case, I invite you to walk south and have the pleasure. So why did the people do this in 1811? Let me say also the key person was somebody named DeWitt Clinton, who in 1807, when this commission was set up, had the pleasure of being both the mayor of New York City and a state senator in Albany. He calculated the politics as being such is that if you want to get a grid, which he wanted to get, you're not going to get it through local politics. You had to go to the state level. And so this grid was actually imposed through state legislation because DeWitt Clinton, the mayor, wrote a letter to DeWitt Clinton, the senator, and said, please pass this legislation. And he did. And this was also, by the way, the fellow who did the Erie Canal. This was a fairly creative person. By the way, do you get the Erie Canal through voluntary contract? And the answer is no. That's one for Ilya Soman to think about. Do we like the Erie Canal in New York City? Well, I'll let you think about that. What do we have in New York? We have an extremely boring layout of blocks that you're all familiar with on these rectangles. Whether this was the right call is a complicated story. An interesting criterion for street grids is what maximizes the value of the land, and it's not clear that these long rectangles are the way to go compared to other sorts of things. So they made a bunch of judgments, and they didn't necessarily do it right. So then the question is, why did they do this? And why, after they approved that grid, why did local government for 60 years, or some people calculate it as 90 years, implement this program? That's a remarkable thing. You might think that a later government would say, we're not doing this anymore. This program is a loser. They implemented this over a very, very long period of time, and they were extremely proud of it. They thought that New York City was growing, and it was growing in part because of this, because I think they thought it raised land values, Ed Glazer's theory of good urban policy. If you have good urban policies, you're going to raise land values. They have this very amusing, and I don't know if you can read it there, this very amusing quotation when they designed this boring layout, because by and large, aesthetic people look at New York and they are just appalled, by the way, by these rectangles. They said, we are aware of the supposed improvements of circles, ovals, and stars, but we're not doing it. We're doing boring rectangles. And why are they doing boring rectangles? They say, because it's actually cheap to build right-angled houses. Rectangles are the way to go with lots, are the way to go with buildings, are the way to go with rooms. This room is basically a rectangle. And if you want to efficiently allocate your land, you go with rectangles. And that was their thinking. Here's a city that did not go this route. And so you might think whether New York City would be a better city if it went the Washington, D.C. route of having lots and lots of diagonals. This is the L'Enfant plan that was out there from 1793. The commissioners in New York were very aware of the L'Enfant plan because they were thinking about stars, they could think about L'Enfant. The L'Enfant plan, if you know Washington, angles various diagonals toward the Capitol and toward the White House, which are two of the two circled monuments there. Is that a better way to go? And diagonals are a good thing for transportation because you can go in a straight line when you want to actually go diagonally, and so on. But they didn't go that route, and so think about whether that was a good decision on their part, and we'll come back to it. The grid, this boring grid, is actually embraced by the city of Boston. If you're interested in streets, the outlier in the United States is the city of Boston. You can live there for years and never find your way around because it grew up spontaneously from the bottom up. It never had its grid and whatever, except, and this is interesting about Boston, if you know Boston, is that the Back Bay was filled. It's where Commonwealth Avenue is. When the Back Bay was filled, what did Boston do? They laid a grid upon the Back Bay. So they somehow saw some advantages in going rectangular as well. So why did the commissioners impose this boring layout on the city of New York? And so let me just indicate some of the advantages of the grid that might have given rise to why it might have increased land values, and so I just lift these off. If you want to have through transportation arteries, all that boring traffic on First Avenue and Second Avenue and so forth, you're not going to get it through contracts. You're going to have to get it through some kind of public planning, and the grid provides for that. When you first come to Manhattan as a visitor and get out of Grand Central Station, let's say, You walk for 5 minutes and you say to yourself, I think I can find my way around this city. You don't say that about Boston ever. You don't say that about London ever and whatever, but in fact, it is very easy to orient yourself. The whole purpose of cities, as developed by economists, is agglomeration economics. Allow people to get together for economic transactions, social events, and so forth, and finding one another and moving around easily and being able to orient yourself quickly is, in fact, a great advantage. So in New York, not only have the boring grid, you have the extremely boring numbering system and whatever, which makes it all extraordinarily transparent. If you have these microgrids, which New York has south of here, you do have lots of awkward intersections. You end up with lots of little triangular lots and so forth. And if you're interested in efficient use of land, you want to avoid that pattern. And DeWitt Clinton in 1807 is insistent on avoiding it because he thinks there's advantages of some sort in doing that. If you have rectangular lots, surveying is much easier to do. You're much less likely to have disputes. There's a famous work by Leibkap and Luke in the Journal of Political Economy showing that square farms, of all things, rectangular farms, are vastly more valuable than irregularly shaped farms, partly because there are fewer boundary disputes. The last thing I mentioned here is simplifying land transactions. You cannot imagine what the New York real estate markets were after this grid was imposed. Auction houses for lots. Was it easy to identify where your lot was and what you were pricing it, and for a buyer to compare whether that was a good buy to elsewhere? Many of the lots were all 100 feet deep, either 20 or 25 feet wide. It was a piece of cake to do that, so sort of the uniformity of the transactions helped things. Here is the kind of thing that you see. These are excerpts from the Boulogne book, which is a wonderful book about this grid. Showing you how an auctioneer advertised the lots that were for sale and how similar they were. This is one of the most remarkable slides I know about the history of New York. Unbelievable slide. West 133rd Street, 1877, Harlem going up. Entrepreneurs, we don't know who they were. We don't know how they got their financing. I think if you're interested in the history of business, you might write a book about this to figure out who these people were. Do these people know what the street pattern is in this neighborhood? Do they know the lot sizes that are likely to occur across the street? They are using stock designs based upon the standard New York lot to build these brownstones, and they're building them like crazy. They're out there in the wilderness and whatever, but they know a great city is sweeping north from NYU, and they're going to be part of the action, and they are building for it. Okay, let me just say briefly about, because streets are my passion, is that it's not at all clear New York City chose a maximizing shape for its blocks. These blocks may have been too long. Notice that the patterns here are, you see the New York blocks are very, very long. My own city of New Haven had massively inefficient blocks because they were much, much too large. If you've not been to Savannah, Georgia, think about the advantages of smaller blocks, because maybe this would have been even better. Savannah is the most interesting layout of a city. Again, you would never get this by contract. It had to be done by some central authority. They have little parks interspersed with their small blocks. And Savannah is, I think, one of the extremely interesting cities of the United States. New Yorkers ended up being extraordinarily proud of their grid, thought that this was essential to their success, and again, as I say, stuck with it for 60 to 80, 90 years. But the planners made some mistakes. They didn't have enough open space. Do we like Central Park? Was that one of the triumphs of the 19th century? New Yorkers would have said, you bet it is. And you get Central Park by contract, and the answer is you don't get it by contract. You don't get it in a Nozikian world. You don't get it in a anarcho-capitalist world. You need eminent domain to get a Central Park, and that was retrofitted on the grid in New York City. Okay, let me just say that my comments here about the grids and the advantages of grids, I think, are comments about central cities. If you want to think about streets, it might be that if you're in Phoenix, that you like the grid that you have, which is the Jeffersonian township and section system that exists in the United States from Ohio west, basically. But notice what you see there is actually developers on their own initiative putting in curved streets. So it might be that what maximizes land values elsewhere are not grids. Again, whether these in fact do maximize land value and whether that's the sole criterion is a complex story. There was an article that I sent in for part of the continuing legal education for people who are actually interested in streets, and you can get that citation. Okay, let me turn now to a final couple of topics that are dealt with by the anarcho-capitalists, and I think very badly. Air pollution. Here's one approach to air pollution. We'll do it the Kosian way. It doesn't matter what the property rights are. We will bargain costlessly to the optimal amount of pollution, regardless of what property rights were. Therefore, we can have no rights against pollution. What's interesting about all the three anarcho-capitalists who I list here is that none of them come to that solution. They all rather, and this is extremely puzzling to me and a sign, I think, of the weakness of their thought, is they all decide that what we should have is class action lawsuits. It's as if they've read each other, and in fact, they do cite each other because they're something of a crowd. And I think Rothbard, this is not good property. This is not a good property exam. If Rothbard writes this, if you're going to enjoin anyone from injecting pollution, you don't need a class action. All you need is a single individual because you're going to enjoin all those polluters, whatever. But notice that you have an enormous amount of state coercion here under this system. These are rules being created by judges. You have a state. They have to be enforced. If you're going to enjoin and people are violating the injunction, you have to be imagining an enormous state and whatever. So Rothbard kind of bails out on this issue. He could have said, let's ignore pollution and leave it to voluntary transaction. He doesn't say that. He comes up with something utterly inconsistent with his own beliefs, I think. David Friedman, class actions by the many victims against the many polluters. This is a really big class action. Let me say, we are all victims, and we are almost all of us polluters, and this is a whopper, and if you are interested in transactions costs, I think this is a huge loser. And notice again, it's David Friedman opting for coercion. So why he does this in this particular context, I don't know. And Nozick, not being a lawyer, says group suits against polluters rather than saying class actions. But it's got to be the same kind of idea. So my sense is this is not a sign of strength. My own view is that actually we need to act on pollution, that having coercion by the EPA, bad as the EPA is going to be, in fact, will work better than wasting all our time with these class action payouts from all of us to all of us. Okay, the last topic that I mentioned is the welfare state. The anarcho-capitalists are on the same page on all of this, which is surely we care about the situation of the needy, but the right institutions to deal with this are voluntary institutions. Let it be families, let it be charities. Let's not tax ourselves to give through the welfare state to people. Let's rather do it through voluntary transactions. And they're very consistent about this. Nozick is particularly insistent about it. Let me just say that, and this is an example of where both Hayek and Milton Friedman are not fast thinkers. They write explicitly about this. They say they have a sophisticated view about it. They say maybe in a world of hunter-gatherers, maybe in a world of small towns, that those other systems would be sufficient. But in mass modern society, this will not work. You have to have taxation, and they both come out explicitly in favor of some sort of financial support for the people who are particularly destitute. I don't think they've thought very much about it. Milton Friedman for years pushed for a minimum income tax, as you know, as an illustration of where he was on this, and I think he did not deal with the problem of moral hazard. My own view is there are lots of people in their 20s who would like to spend their time playing video games in their basements. And in my own view, we should not be making transfer payments to those people, and I don't think Milton Friedman fully encountered that notion. Okay, so let me just now finish up with my last slide and urge what I regard as a more constructive thing for somebody in the room to be thinking about than how to perfect anarcho-capitalism, which I think is a dead end. At the end of his book, Kahneman challenges the realism of a later book by Milton Friedman that he wrote with his wife, which is called Free to Choose. He takes dead aim at this. And he says, think about our two systems of making decisions that he's described at length in the book. We actually aren't very good at making decisions. Our first system, doing things fast, is often mistake-prone, and we regret our decisions, and we realize once we actually labor over the decision that we made the wrong decision. The second decision process is the rational actor that we would like to have in economics, but we're so damn lazy that we don't do it very often, and therefore we often fall back to number one. And therefore, we aren't that good at choosing, and this is a real challenge to, I think, many classical liberals, because they do, a lot of classical liberalism rests on the deferring to choices, and Kahneman is challenging basically that model. So my sense is this has led to literature, as you probably know, on libertarian paternalism, about structuring of decision processes with nudges, Cass Sunstein and Richard Thaler. There's a pretty substantial literature on this. But I think if you are a libertarian and do think that people should have a lot of autonomy and freedom of choice and whatever, this is an important discussion to get involved with, to think about to what extent Kahneman's analysis, for example, does challenge a classical liberal thought. So as I understand it, we now have time for questions and answers, and we should move to that. And I've tried to provoke you by insulting both the praising 19th century New York, insulting 20th century New York, and challenging anarcho-capitalists. So I'll ask, Richard is irrepressible, so we'll come back to him later, but there was yeah. So yes. Yes, I think the microphones are there for, so everyone will hear you.
All right, so I'm very excited. The general kind of gist of the examples you gave were to give an example of a large public works project or something that was done by a state historically, and then to say, well, because it was done by a state historically, it couldn't have been done another way. And so you gave the example, I'm just going to pick one because I've just been reading about this, the Brooklyn Bridge. Yeah. So you gave the example of the Brooklyn Bridge, and you said this couldn't be done through private means, through a private aggregation of property. But I would just point to, so for instance, the Pennsylvania station, Penn Station, was actually assembled through a private means. So Alexander Cassatt, who's the brother of Mary Cassatt, the painter, I thought that was interesting. They went to the Tenderloin district, and to be sure, they definitely used secrecy to avoid holdout value, but they ended up purchasing all the land that became Penn Station and built totally through contract, the Nozikian world that you give. They did it totally through private contract. So I guess my question is why, and then you look at like James J. Hill, he was the Great Northern Railroad guy, and a lot of the railroad in the north was done without eminent domain. So I guess my question to you is why are there structural reasons why this couldn't take place?
Well, the standard kind of analysis of this is that numbers matter, that if you have to assemble 1,000 parcels, all of whom have sort of veto power over what you're trying to do, which might be the case with some pipelines or some highways, or I think the Brooklyn Bridge literally probably did involve condemnation of hundreds and hundreds of parcels. and they had no choice, they had decided where they wanted to have the bridge, and they really had no option to move it, that in those circumstances, you're more likely to need eminent domain. If you're trying to assemble land for a couple of blocks, and this is, I think, Ilya Soman's critique of a lot of economic development takings, is that kind of assembly can often be done through voluntary transactions, and that there are eminent domain abuses. One of the reforms that's sometimes talked about is pay more than just compensation, for example, to discourage the use of those powers and to provide more confidently compensation to the people. So I do think the numbers are, the standard analysis is numbers. Richard is here, and I'm sure is irrepressible as always, so we'll get his view on this eventually.
And can I make one last quick point? Okay, and then the last quick point is on the lighthouses, because I can't
Yeah.
resist. So the sort of classical argument made, and this was made, I think James Buchanan made it and Samuelson made it, is that the light beams are indivisible, and so it would be impossible to basically row out in the middle and charge each other. But doesn't this kind of thinking sort of beg the question, so that if you were in a system where private enterprise was allowed and this had to be provided for the market, you would develop mechanisms for specifically targeting, and you could have kind of GPS devices or things like that. And so the actual belief in market failure hinders the kind of tools that could solve market failure.
I think that's a nice point. My sense is the literature on lighthouses is pretty robust, and I'll in my article that I'll eventually submit on this, I'll cite all 5 of these critiques of COAS. Goes into some of these issues, and it may be that today, for example, lighthouses, I should say, are obsolete, as we know through GPS as it happened. But there were an interesting collection of institutions for lighthouses, and occasionally they were done by charity. So I spoke a little too strongly. Often these were done by monasteries, where the monks would put out lights, and it was expected that the people who benefited, the shippers who benefited from those lights, would make donations to the monasteries, and that occasionally worked a little bit. But by and large, in situations where it was tried and there was not a government involvement in collecting of the fees, the lighthouses disappeared, and that quite well documented by David Van Zandt and other scholars thereafter. And Coase misleadingly says it can be done by private enterprise. What he means is that you can hire a private firm, just to repeat the analogy, you can hire a private firm to put off your fireworks over the Hudson River for the 4th of July. That can be done privately that way, but it won't be done voluntarily. You won't get it by contract. You have to have taxpayer supporting of that. So let me throw that example back at you. Do you think you can imagine a world where we get 4th of July fireworks, and take care of the free rider problem?
Should I answer?
Yeah.
So I appreciate your point that it's going to be incredibly or prohibitively expensive to collect money from every single viewer of the firework, right? So that's the logic for why the state must provide it. But there are private parties that do provide fireworks. The New York fireworks is sponsored and run, I believe, by Macy's, right? And the one over the Hudson River on 4th of July. So there is a residual claimant who has no expectation whatsoever of individual contractual payments from every single viewer or enjoyer of the positive externality. Yeah. What they do expect is it's so well publicized that we all seem to know that it's the Macy's fireworks or the Macy's parade, that there will be some other benefit. So now this leads well into my next question. So the only alternative to state provisioning, in my mind, is not private provisioning where every single person is contracting with every other individual. It could be a large number of individuals contracting with one single private party. So something like you see in the Disney City, right? It was one entirely assembled by private. Just like Max mentioned, to avoid holdouts, they use secrecy. The other is it's entirely run privately. It has its own police station, its own fire station, its own sewage lines.
Its own fireworks, by the way.
And also fireworks. In which case, you have a very large number of private individuals
Yep.
who contract individually with Disney.
Yep.
And so, what I might think is yours might be a scale argument with a residual claimant and not necessarily a public private division. So, that's my.
Well, the scale
main-
argument is related to my response to the earlier question, which is the larger things get very often, the larger the numbers of land parcels that are involved, the harder it is to do it by contract. Richard, good time for Richard.
As you well know, unlike the incorrigible Max, I'm on the classical liberal side. But what struck me as being odd about the talk, and I'd like to have your reflection to it, is what about the various kinds of failures in putting grids together and other devices, and how you deal with them. So if you look at the San Francisco grid, remember they had a section going south and a section going northeast, and they didn't match them up. And so to this day along Market Street, you have complete chaos. And so the question that one wants to ask on this thing, I have two questions, is how do you make sure when you put these things together that you get institutional arrangements that can optimize the way in which they go? And what set of tools do you need?
Right.
And you mentioned, in fact, New York, you thought made a mistake in terms of the size of the block. So it would be interesting for you to tell us how it is that you want to assemble the information which will allow you to do the correct way with respect to a function, which I also agree with you, is essentially a public function. Right? That's the first part. The second part is there is no public choice in the model that you just gave, which is a little bit odd. And the issue about eminent domain does not only apply to streets, but it also applies to all the other stuff that you talked about. And so if you talk about modern regulation, zoning, and so forth, all of these things essentially got their lift because you decided that there was a low-level rational basis test of one sort or another, starting with Euclid, if you recall, in the expansion of the definitions of nuisance and everything else like that, which led to sort of radical overclaiming by the state. So the question I wanted to ask for you is, implicit in your model with respect to the land, you essentially assume that if you're going to take this sort of land, that you're going to owe some compensation that's needed. And in New York City, as you remember, the way this was done, you lay out the grid, you don't take any land, but then when the time comes to take those streets, you take it, but you don't have to compensate for anything that somebody wants to build on it, which is the correct solution. But
If they build it after the map,
Yes,
yeah, right.
if they after the map is putting out. But you still get things like air rights and Penn Central and so forth. So the question I wanted to ask you is, if you put the public choice dynamic into this, and you look at the zoning and the other kinds of uses, how would you apply the takings clause to the regulatory side? Would there be a discontinuity to the physical occupation cases, or would there be a continuity between the two of them?
Okay, good questions. Let me just say about and measuring the success of the, first off, I do think the main lobby that would have lobbied in favor of the DeWitt Clinton plan in 1811 would have been people interested in real estate.
I
And the
agree.
biggest player was John Jacob Astor, the richest man in the United States, who started off with fur and then moved into real estate and knew how to play the game extremely well. On the other hand, I think that Astor's wanted something that would raise the value of land, and that by and large that was pretty close to consistent with what was beneficial for New Yorkers in general.
I agree with that.
And so, and to me, the success of the grid is, it's remarkable to me that this program, which took enormous amount of effort and required leveling of all sorts of streets and unbelievable changes to the city, was implemented over all these decades, and the people of New York stuck with it. They thought it was a winner, and what Henry James and people like that who lived in this area would say, we live in the most incredible town. Every 5 years, everybody moves 3 streets uptown or something like that. They said it was just growing like crazy, and they thought it was a winner. So that the fact that they stuck with it strikes me as a sign in favor of the New York.
No, I agree with that. I think
Yeah.
one of the things you might want to explain is
Yeah.
the grading issue is simply huge under these circumstances.
Yeah.
Because what happens is if you want to have a level street, which you need for horses, then there's the real question of what you do with the plots if you can't get in and out of the plot. So you
Right.
have to level huge portions of land to make this work, I think is
right.
what's going on.
Good. And there's a recent paper out in the Virginia Law Review
Yes.
by Molly
Molly.
Grady about state courts deciding that people who were stranded because their lot was way above the street, in many states anyway, were entitled to compensation under the state constitution. Which brings me to your second point, which is Richard and I actually disagree, despite our comradeship on the basketball court, believe it or not, many years ago, on constitutional matters. I am not somebody who would be activist at the federal level, in particular on lots of land issues. I'm a defender, believe it or not, of the Kelo decision, which is anathema to Ilya Somin and to Richard as well, on the ground that the mistake there was made by the Connecticut Supreme Court. We don't need national rules on economic development taking, and therefore I'm not as aggressive as Richard has been at times anyway, and with the federal constitution on deciding things.
Somebody else? Come. Hi.
Okay, Bob, I really enjoyed the talk. And so you might think that one of the kind of sources of the transaction costs that kind of impede contracting to develop the bridge or the
Right.
big infrastructure is the form of land ownership takes. And this is a point that Lee Fennell has recently made in this paper, Fee Simple Obsolete.
Right.
Okay? And where she argues that it's really the monopoly that the fee simple provides, that's really a big obstacle to assembling land. And it's a big issue now, she says, because we need to, repurpose land on a large scale in dense urban areas. So I'm kind of, and the alternative, of course, one alternative would be something more, having land ownership take more like the form of a lease. So I guess the question I'm kind of asking you is, do you think that there is a problem with the fee simple, which is the kind of most pervasive form of land ownership today?
Right.
Or do you think the transaction, and was it kind of a historical mistake to make the fee simple basically the predominant form of land ownership? Yeah, that's my question.
I'm a huge fan of the fee simple. Disagree with Lee's thesis for Hayekian reasons. That the great thing about the fee simple and individual land ownership is it gives decisions about the use of land to the person with local knowledge about what that parcel, about the structures on that parcel, about the land on that parcel, and that this is a wonderful way of invoking localized knowledge in a Hayekian way. And I'm extremely skeptical. This is exactly the kind of situation where I don't think experts who control a large amount of land, whether it's a Disney World or whether it's a government or whatever, will do as well in coordinating and making decisions about land use as will these decentralized landowners. So I am a Hayekian and a big fan of the fee simple. Yes.
Yeah, so with Milton Friedman's point about the provision of welfare, how in smaller groups of people, you're probably going to see people with personal relationships, somebody at stake who will take care of people if they get in trouble. In cities, you're going to get less and less of that. It's more impersonal. It seems to me like a lot of the things that you and a lot of these thinkers are assuming about like the culture of the decision makers is that they're all the impersonal city people, and that it's totally inflexible who they're going to feel they have close relationships to. And so I guess what I'm wondering is how much room is there for taking into account what you can do to change culture and creating the provision of these things you couldn't have otherwise. So, like what comes to mind is there's organizations like the Mormon Church, like the Catholic Church, that can raise massive amounts of people. And if people feel like they're connected to these other people, they're going to respond and be willing to contribute, right? They don't see it as that impersonal thing, and then the calculus kind of seems to break down. This wouldn't solve necessarily things like the pipeline, right? But it would seem to take care of others. And if that's so, do you think that part of if there was a path forward, would be to encourage people to see themselves as part of a, part of a group, I guess?
Yeah. Well, I'll invoke the phrase civil society, of which I'm a huge fan. If you're a decentralizer, and Hayek would, I think, be of this stripe, you obviously want to encourage all those kinds of institutions. A problem in designing a welfare state is that people are mobile, and that creates enormous numbers of complications. And there are people, George Stigler was very much of this view, that welfare state policy is inherently national policy. You might even say it's even national in scope. So that if New York City, for example, has, if some locality has more generous policies toward distribution, there's a problem that rich people will move out of there and poor people will move in there, and therefore the design of the welfare state is very complicated. I follow those issues some. All I can say is that both Hayek and Friedman were very clearly in favor of some sort of welfare state, and that comes crystal clear in their writings all the way along. Hayek says this in The Road to Serfdom. He's on that page from the get-go. So I'm not, I think we're better off having strong families and churches and other agencies and so forth, and the welfare state should be designed to try to mobilize them. Families, I think, but the whole nugget of our civilization is the household and the family. And if we lose it with the household and the family, we've really lost it to a great degree. So I'm very, very supportive of using those institutions as we can. But my own view is the state inevitably will be somewhat involved as well.
Hi, Bob. So this is terrific, and I have an empirical question. I'm not quite sure how how I think it would turn out, but it's something of the nature. Do you think it's easier to build a bridge or a tunnel, controlling for the technology and the cost of it? And I'm sort of curious about surface grids and subterranean grids also. And what's getting me was the suggestion about the Macy's Day Parade. It seems that, or the fireworks, that they're engaged in some type of joint production. They're producing both the fireworks show and goodwill. They can't capture from the consumers for the show, but they can capture on the goodwill. And maybe the monks, too, who are also doing the lighthouses, they're capturing. So on the surface level, there are multiple things that might actually facilitate the transaction. So maybe the bridge would be easier than the tunnel. Although I once did a project on the best titled paper I ever never published, Holdouts and Holy Men. And I was looking at the church on the south side of Chicago trying to assemble land for shopping centers, and it turns out that the holdup problem was worse with the church than with private developers. So it could cut in the other way. So what are your intuitions about? I saw those 5 costs those we're trying to measure on the surface, transportation, building, the view easements, and all of that.
When you go subterranean, way down subterranean, the efficient scale of ownership can be quite different than it is on the surface. So that our fee simples, by and large, are based upon what's the best surface use and whatever. In many nations, subterranean minerals are owned by the state, and so it's all unitized in the state. Many people think that was advantageous because for oil and gas, for example, you don't have to unitize the field, it's already unitized in the state. The counter to that is an interesting one, which is why was fracking invented in the United States? And many people say the reason fracking was invented in the United States is we have subterranean ownership of minerals, and therefore the incentives for people to be creative in how they mine were greater because you could do it through transactions. You didn't have to wait for the state to invent fracking or to allow fracking, and therefore this what looked like a disadvantageous form of mineral ownership actually led to advances in fracking technology. And this actually relates to the first question that was asked, which is that the nature of property rights affects the levels of innovation and whatever, and we had innovation on fracking perhaps because I do think, for me, a pipeline which doesn't go down very far is no different than a fee simple. That I would prefer that the fee simple owner own down to the depth of the pipeline, but when you get down to deep minerals and so forth, I think it's more complicated. Just as it is when you go up to avigation easements and so forth. Yeah.
Yeah, about a year ago, I took Professor Rizzo's course on classical liberalism, and Professor Epstein came in to guest lecture on a couple of papers he wrote. And Professor Epstein can speak for himself on his position, but it seemed to me that he would agree with you that there are market failures that would justify government coercion to get things accomplished in general. Now, however, when it comes to taking money from one person, simply to give it to another person, he could not find, at least in the class at that time, a philosophical basis for doing that. Now, I think in one of his books, I read that he would support that as a matter of public policy, but still, there was no philosophical basis for doing that. Would you have a philosophical basis for doing that? I would like to hear from Professor Epstein whether he has found one. I wrote a paper for the class that I thought found one, and it was called Curing Epstein's Bar. That's just a joke, anyway. I actually named it that, but go ahead, please.
Well, I will have a mundane answer to it, and then we can hear from Richard directly, which is it's possible that the transactions costs of doing this through the state are lower than doing it through all these admirable institutions of civil society, given the problems of coordination there and so forth, and that for example, I do not give to beggars on the street, and the reason is a statist reason. I say, I don't know if this person's deserving, but I think there are specialists out there in the world who do know whether this person is worthy, because they can apply for assistance of various kinds, and those people know about who's worthy, and I'm going to defer to those experts. And that's sort of so I don't know whether utilitarianism is respectable in this crowd, but it's respectable with me. And to me, if it's cheaper to do it that way, if it's cheaper to do it through to do the state, that might be a reason to do it through the state.
Thank you.
I take a position which is, somewhat similar to yours. And what I start off with is, what is the justification you want for voluntary transfers to be made through a charitable system? And this is a non-trivial story, because I still remember the longest lunch I ever had in my life was in 1972 with Aaron Director, who insisted that redistribution of wealth based upon need was not an appropriate measure because this was all subjective and you could not make interpersonal comparisons of utility. And he told the story of man who had a rupee, and the question was whether he gave it to the Maharaja or whether he gave it to the untouchable. And the Maharaja looked at the man and said, why on earth would you want to waste your money on the untouchable? And he thought that this was a decisive answer. It took me about 5 years to realize that there was madness in this particular remark, because if you actually looked at the way in which the distributions go, there is no voluntary redistribution from poor to rich. It's always going in the opposite direction. And the argument that you start to make is people do make interpersonal comparisons of utility, but they're better at making them for themselves with their own money and watching after it than trying to get some independent party coming in and telling you what the differences turn out to be. So I think the case for private charity, laissez-faire, is really very strong. And I agree, I think, with the comments that were made that the amount of this stuff that will start to take place in a voluntary society, particularly at the peak of laissez-faire when you didn't have much of this system, was simply enormous. For example, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society made sure that every person who came off the boat was put into a private home under care the day they arrived, and they did this for hundreds of thousands, indeed millions of people, in the period between about 1885 and about 1915. Just straight voluntarism there. So that's the first point. The second point is, you're right about the mobility and all the difficulties. So the way in which I try to put it is that the public justification for these charities is most comfortable when the amount of transfers you're making are basically at the same level that you would find in a voluntary society, given all the difficulties you have in measurement and coordination. And that the great difficulty in the issue is not deciding whether or not this is a good idea at that level, but the great question that Hayek never answered is how do you make sure that the national health system, which gives you a bed when you're acutely ill, doesn't become the Medicare and Medicaid system in the ACA of today? And so the reason why I get skeptical about this stuff is I don't think you could hold to the optimum. So you have this terrible choice of too much or too little. And what happens is once the coercive stuff gets in there, the voluntary stuff disappears, which is surely the case with charity. Much less aid to the poor today than in 1935. Most of it now goes to education, arts, and other kind of rich-to-rich kinds of people. So my answer would be, philosophically, that would be the justification, but institutionally, I think it's very precarious.
Well, I agree with two statements that you made, that there's going to be some, if the state takes over or gets involved, there'll be some crowding out of these other institutions, and that should be taken into account. And the second one is I think our welfare state is quite a mess, and I mentioned some housing programs which I think are utterly worthless. These affordable housing units, we now produce these very, we spend $1 million to provide a unit to somebody who's a relatively low income group, rather than giving them $200,000 in cash or $300,000 in cash, which they often would prefer to getting that unit, and that there's massive inefficiency there. So I do worry about the expansion of our, or the nature of our welfare state as it has grown. Clay has been, yes. Clay, and then we finish, okay?
So I wanted to make an observation and then ask a question. So the observation is, I have no doubt that some of the questions suggest that public goods can be created by private actors. The Penn Station example is a nice one. I think the Walt Disney World is actually a bad example because known by its official name, the Reedy Creek Improvement District, is nothing other than a state-created monopoly with an extraordinarily state-supported restrictive set of basically ordinances that get in the way of voluntary transactions rather than facilitate them. A nice example, I think, is put forward by Russell Hart in his book on collective action, where he recounts that Howard Hughes was when he moved to Nevada as an insomniac, loved late-night westerns and couldn't find any on Nevada TV. So he bought a TV station and had it show nothing other than westerns late at night, therefore creating the public good of allowing insomniac Nevadans to watch westerns all night long. And that, I think, is sort of the point. So my understanding is always in trying to get these debates about private versus public provision of public goods is as compared to what? And the issue with the private situation is the private actor may provide a public good, but will provide it at a quality and at a quantity that is consistent with the interests of the private provider, which may or may not coincide well with the interests of the public at large. Of course, as you just suggested, the public actors don't necessarily entirely reflect the desire of the public for quantity and quality, but let's not fall into the nirvana fallacy of assuming that private actors who provide public goods do so in a manner that coincides perfectly with public interest, while public actors do not. In fact, what's going on is as compared to what, and I think that's the crucial question, not who can do it, but who can do it better, or in a manner more consistent with public interest. The question is, and the slide has now disappeared, but
right.
I remember it well enough, to the extent that System 1 and System 2 are in place, and that System 1 is the more common one and extraordinarily error-prone, and that System 2 may be less error-prone but is extraordinarily exhausting. What are you telling us, or what is Kahneman telling us about contract itself? Because if the suggestion is, gee, the alternative to public provision is private contract, are you telling us that contract itself may be sufficiently deeply flawed that we have to be very wary of relegating a lot of our public-oriented decisions to the contracting process?
Okay, on your last point, Kahneman got this prize in economics because, in part, behavioral, as I understand it, in most economics department, and Mario can describe what happens at NYU, behavioral economics has been quite well accepted across the board economics department. Still controversial to some extent, but the implications for economics are pretty profound, and I do think that this is a frontier issue on which we should all be working. Many of us are confident that we, even using System 1, that we do pretty well. We go out and go to McDonald's, and we probably do use System 1 at McDonald's, rather than actually looking at that menu afresh and so forth. We kind of in the habit of getting the Big Mac or whatever it is. So I do think there are enormous implications for country, and I would think that that's coming in. And then you have people who, people like Sunstein and Thaler who are trying to structure choices in some sorts of ways, and maybe that makes sense. And I can imagine there are libertarians who might take a look at all of this, maybe in economics departments who just say this is. We're not buying any of this and whatever. It just doesn't, for a variety of reasons. One of the examples that has come up repeatedly is the fireworks displays, and I'm getting the impression that it's all Macy's money, and I would be surprised, actually, if that were the case. But I think it's an interesting empirical study. Think about next time you look at fireworks, who's paying for it, and I think it often comes out of the taxpayers' pocket. I know it does in my city and a small city, and my guess is that's the case in lots of these situations. More expensive fireworks displays in New York City as well. The final.
It's my specialty. So since it's the last word, I think it's important that it be about time. And
Yes.
so when you talk about fireworks, that's pretty much immediate bang for the buck. And when you talk about something like the structure of a city like Manhattan, the payoff for that, you see a century into the future. And so I was thinking of this as you were talking, and there's a lot of, you speak of behavioral economics, a number of studies suggest that people individually excessively discount future consumption or cost in a way that is illogical unless you price in the risk that you yourself might die, and so then therefore what is the point of putting a lot of effort into this, into the future? Right. And so my question would be, do you think that private or public systems are better at solving long-term problems? The instant question would be probably government, but in a democracy, every 4 years you get turnover. Presumably, we seem like a spry young crowd. Hopefully all of us have a life expectancy past the next election. Is there any systemic reason to believe that government is better at solving long-term problems than private actors?
My guess is there's a literature on this. There should be. I mean, it's a wonderful question. And I think behavioral economics suggests that individuals and therefore the private sector will not be all that good at discounting and whatever. And I think there's lots of good reasons to think the public sector is going to be pretty bad at it as well. That people in office might only consider the initial term. A wonderful thing for us is that politicians actually care about their place in history and so forth, so that if they're conspicuous, I'm not sure if people who are not conspicuous care much about their place of history because they recognize their place in history is zero. But DeWitt Clinton may have cared about this, and New York City may have benefited from it. So I think you set up some good questions. I do think that's where libertarian intellectuals should spend their energy on those kinds of issues, rather than this will-o'-the-wisp of anarcho-capitalism, which I regard as a total dead end. So thank you.
Look, what we learn from all of this is that essentially the study of society is the study of rival imperfections between alternative systems, both of which disappoint acutely. And so the question is just how do you slow down the race to the bottom under all of these circumstances? And Robert has given us some instinct as to how it's done. Some of his points I agree with. Others have been sources of disagreement for 40-odd years and will, God willing, continue to be such for another 40-odd years between us. But there is, I think, some reception food over here, right, Eva, opened up to the world at large, and so why don't we give them another round of applause and then go over to the food.